me and keep my commandments. Okay? Hopefully you've recognized that this is the first of the commandments of God, right? First of the 10 Commandments. Okay? There is a little bit of a discrepancy between the Catholic understanding of the 10 Commandments and the Protestant version of the 10 Commandments. Okay? And it has to do with this first passage that we just read. The Catholic version looks at this whole passage as one commandment. The main first commandment against God, right? How to sin against God? Well, you worship something else, another image of God, anything else. That means that you are sinning against God, and this is the greatest of the commandments that you can break, that you do not recognize the sovereignty of God as Lord. Okay? What Protestants do is they actually take this and divide it into 2 separate commandments. So that the first commandment is the first part, you shall have no other gods before me. And the second commandment, you shall not make for yourselves a graven image. Right? And so they split that off, and they have 2 commandments at that point. If you were to go on to the very last of the commandments, in the book of Exodus, it's expressed as, you shall not covet your neighbor's goods, or his male or female slave, or his wife, or anything that belongs to him, or his donkeys, or his goods, and all. It just goes on and on, right? Well, the Catholic understanding is to take the word wife out, okay, even though it's right there in the middle of all the things that you should not covet, and makes that a separate commandment, okay? Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. And then it lumps everything together, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. Okay? Whereas the Protestant churches, they keep that together and they simply say, thou shalt not covet. Okay? So in the end, we all have 10, if that makes sense, okay? So we split off the first one, they split off the last one. No, the other way around. They split off the first one, we split off the last one. But in the end, we all have 10, okay? The commandments are repeated twice in the Bible. The first time in the book of Exodus, the second time in the book of Deuteronomy, okay? And when they are given in the book of Deuteronomy, they follow the Catholic tradition, okay? Or the Catholic tradition follows the book of Deuteronomy, okay? So they split it off, the last 2 commandments, the same way we do, right? So the Catholic Church feels very encouraged by that distinction. But it's interesting because not all Protestants also hold the same division. For example, Lutherans are united with the Catholic Church in the way they divide the 10 Commandments. The real problem lies in the fact that if you were to count the commandments the first time they're given in the book of Exodus, there's only 9. There's only 9 commandments, but they're named the Decalogue or the 10 Commandments because of the numerical value, 10, having its mystical symbolism. And if you remember what that meant, what does the number 10 mean? Completion. Yeah, excellent. So when we receive the 9 specific commandments and we're told this is the complete law of God, the word for completion is the same as 10. This is the 10, right? It's complete. And so the real meaning was that these commandments are complete. There's nothing more you need to add, nothing you can take away. And in that sense, both Protestants and Catholics have the complete law of God. Okay, so we need not worry. But what is the prohibition here? What is the problem? Okay. We said in the very beginning, God says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below, right? You shall not bow down or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Why does he say that? What's the problem? The problem is, does anything other than the human person contain the image of God? No. Okay. Angels. let's add the angels, okay? Because they're a divine person, not divine. They're spiritual persons, but they are also contain the image of God, okay? But on the earth, in terms of the creatures, there is no creature in the sky or in the sea or on the land that is made in the image and likeness of God. There is no creature. There's no such thing as being made in the image of God other than human beings. Okay? Now, when you say to God, God has given you his own image in himself by creating the human person, and he's saying you cannot take any other thing that does not contain my image and worship it as if it contains my image, okay? And worship it as if it's me. That's a sin against me, right? To say that this pigeon or this, I don't know, fish or something, that's God. You cannot worship this creature as if it's God. That's the first sin, right? To take something that's not God and worship it as God. The second sin that this commandment is also speaking against is failing to recognize the actual image of God in people, right? Looking at an animal and saying that this animal is equal to a person in any way fails to recognize the divine image within the person. Okay, so that's another sin that's contained within this first one. Does that make sense? And so God is prohibiting any graven images. You can't make anything and engrave it and and claim that that's God. God has already created his own image and likeness. Your job is to recognize that in each person and treat them with that dignity. Okay? So that's the job of us, every person, to recognize the image and likeness of God in each person. And unfortunately, we fail to do that, right? So make sense? Well, then let's go on. Isaiah 40:18. With whom then will you compare God? To what image will you liken him? You can't, right? Even if you recognize that God has created his image in each person, you cannot equate the image with the original, right? They are not equal. They're not the same. And so you have to recognize that the image points to the original, but the original far surpasses the image, okay? And so there is the need for the image, for us as human beings who are the image of God, to recognize where we came from, where we're going to, God, right? To recognize the divine authority of God in our lives, to realize the subordinate position in which we must hold ourselves in relation to God. Okay? We cannot demand anything from God. This is God. He's the original. We're the image. Right? We need to recognize that relationship. Okay, here comes one of my all-time favorite passages, Matthew 22. Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. Teacher, they said, we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, you hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax. They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, whose image is this, and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then he said to them, so give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. When they heard this, they were amazed, so they left him and went away. I love this passage. It's so good, isn't it? Okay, so the Pharisees and the Herodians. Do you remember the Herodians? They're the ones that work in the Herodian temple, right? Do you remember when Jesus was born? The three magi went to the Herodians, and it was the Herodians that revealed to King Herod, that these people are looking for the newborn Messiah, and they were the ones that were willing, even, willing to have their newborn Messiah massacred. Okay, so these are not necessarily the greatest, the most kind people, right? They don't have that integrity of faith. Okay, let's put it that way. So the Pharisees and the Herodians together, they send their disciples and they go to Jesus and they want to trap him. So there's a trap that they've laid. And they ask the question, right? Is it lawful or is it right? What do you think, Jesus? Is it right to pay the tax to Caesar or not? Okay, so what's the trap? It doesn't sound like much of a trap, but it is. Because to pay the imperial tax, the word imperial indicates what kind of a tax this is. This is the tax to Caesar, who is their king. Okay? And it officially recognizes Caesar as king. If you're paying tribute, if you're paying taxes to this person, then you're acknowledging that, yes, indeed, he is your king. You are his subject. You owe him taxes. Okay? The problem is that for the Jewish people, God has revealed to them that they do not have any king because God alone is their king. Right? I am your king. And then later on, the people rebel against God and they say, we want a king just like all the other nations have a king. You're kind of invisible. And so God says, okay, I'll let you have a king, but under these conditions. He must be a fellow Israelite, right? And he cannot multiply horses, which means he cannot amass an army. He cannot demand too much money. And he cannot have multiple wives. And all three of these were broken by the famous king,
David.
Solomon, his son, right? Solomon was the one that had 1,000 in his harem. Okay, well, biblically speaking. And he also was the one that exacted how much money from the people in tax every year? This is the one and only time that the number comes up in the Old Testament. 666 talents of gold, right? And he also amassed a huge army, right? And the people were losing their family members to the fighting and to poverty, and it was a bad thing. And because of that, they rebelled against him, and when his son became king, they launched a whole insurrection, and they had a civil war. Okay, so that's how the division of the kingdom happened, because Solomon had abused his power as king. Okay, and he was only supposed to be king if he could be a king who recognizes the true kingship of God, and he himself were simply a king in place, taking God's place here on earth. Okay, so that was his position, but he failed. Okay, he failed miserably. At any rate, that's the trap. Okay, do you recognize that Caesar is your king? Okay, and if Jesus says you should pay the tax, that means he recognizes Caesar as king, so he's breaking the Mosaic law. If he tells them not to pay the tax, no, you shouldn't, you should be faithful to the law of Moses, right, the law of God, then what is he doing? He's inciting an insurrection, telling people not to pay taxes to Caesar. And remember, they are slaves at this point, right? They're not free people. And so either way, whatever he chooses would be the wrong answer, okay? That's why it's a trap. And that's why you gotta love it, because Jesus comes out of this trap just so magnificently. And what does he do? He says, well, show me the coin, right? Whose image do you see here? And whose inscription? Because the name of Caesar would have been written underneath there as well, okay? And they say, Caesar's. And then he tells them, well, then give back to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. How do we know what belongs to Caesar? It's very simple. It bears his image. It bears his name. Then he adds the words, and give back to God